What comes to your mind when you hear horror movies?
Hello, Mickey.
The servant of God.
The Conjuring? The Nun? Maybe Pennywise. Today, horror is a massive genre, with several subgenres, countless iconic characters, franchises, and a huge cult-like fan following. However, this was not the case 50 years ago. If you'd ask someone from the early 70s, what's your favorite horror film? You'd probably get hit with Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. Or some ancient vampire movie like fucking Nosferatu from 1922. Violence and gore in cinemas were not that popular. The concept of a horror film was considered cheesy. But then suddenly, something happened. In 3 consecutive years, 3 films were released. All 3 of them went on to redefine horror cinema. The most ironic part? None of the 3 films were released as horror movies. One of them is still not considered horror by the wider audience. It all started with one man, William Blatty, who just published a book that will go on to spend 57 weeks as the New York Times bestseller. Name of the book? Yeah, The Exorcist. It didn't take long for Blatty to go around Hollywood and try to make his novel into a feature film, but the subject matter and the explicit visual gore were enough to scare off most of the studios and directors. As filmmakers like Kubrick and Mike Nichols refused to direct it, Blatty approached an old friend, and William Friedkin got the job. William Friedkin, in The Exorcist, mainly gave the world 2 things. He made the first proper film on the topic of demonic possession, based on real-life events. It was not a horror film, never meant to be one.
Anybody that thinks this is a horror film is wrong. It's a theological thriller.
I saw it as a supernatural detective story.
It was a very religious movie, with deep themes of God, the devil, Catholicism, and faith as a whole. For many people who have watched the complete movie, it's a movie on hope. The film explored the subject of demonic possession like no film had ever done before. It was so impactful as a possession movie that every single movie released after it on the same topic till this day is considered a ripoff of The Exorcist. But the extremely violent nature of the book invited a lot of criticism when the movie was proposed, and people demanded that it be made into an X-rated film, which fortunately didn't happen. But here arose another problem. How were they going to pull off all the supernatural and violent scenes? It was the early 1970s. Visual effects were almost non-existent. Everything needed to be done organically. And the craziest thing about all of these? They fucking did it. The second thing that Friedkin and The Exorcist gave us made it a benchmark, not only for the horror genre, but for cinema as a whole. The unique props, the technical brilliance, the background score, and the spontaneous creativity that took place on the set. The filming techniques used in The Exorcist went on to be used in countless movies over the next few decades. All of these made The Exorcist iconic. Then finally, in 1973, the film was released. The Exorcist took the world by storm. People were fainting left and right inside the theaters, which just added to the mystery of the film, turning it into the first blockbuster in the genre. This led to an increase in the number of up-and-coming filmmakers who wanted to try their luck in horror, but none of them had a budget like The Exorcist. So a lot of low-budget horror films started to pop off, inspired by the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, which had its share of success in the driveway.
They're coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming for you, Barbara. Look, they're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
A young filmmaker named Tobe Hooper was heavily impacted by the rise of crime and violence in San Antonio, Texas. He decided to make a film based on and inspired by a serial killer who makes furniture with human bones, eats human flesh, and wears the skin of his victims. The film was titled after the serial killer, Leatherface. But soon they realized no one is going to the cinemas to watch a film with a title like that. And hence, we got the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was not your traditional horror film. The primary objective of Hooper was to remove the element of supernatural from the movie. It was purely going to be a film on a serial killer wreaking havoc through the city. So much so, the film was marketed as a true story, even though 90% of it was fiction. The only element they had to make it scary was the violence. The budget was extremely tight, so Hooper and crew resorted to a masterful portrayal of subtle violence in addition to its explicit gore. Today, many would agree that this use of subtle violence made the film twice as disturbing. When the film was finally released, some people called it horror porn. It was banned in several countries. Puking was a common occurrence in the theaters. Also, none of the studios were ready to distribute the film due to its gore. So the makers finally released the film with help from the fucking mafia. That's a story for another day. The fate of the film? A commercial blockbuster. More than 16 million tickets sold. The slasher genre was officially invented, and Leatherface became an overnight icon. Even 50 years after the film's release, kids who weren't even born in 1974 name Leatherface as their favorite horror villain. The film also introduced the concepts of a male masked killer and the surviving triumphant woman, which are still used in modern horror movies. It inspired many iconic films through the 70s and 80s like Halloween and Friday the 13th. Even to this day, every slasher movie you see originates from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But what if it didn't come out in 1974? Wouldn't the slasher genre exist today? I don't think so. See, when Tobe Hooper was filming the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a man named Peter Benchley was really fascinated by sharks. So, he wrote down a novel on a 25 feet long, killer great white shark lurking near a coastal town named Amity. The novel, another New York Times bestseller, came into the attention of Universal Studios. They bought the rights, prepared a screenplay, and found an amateur filmmaker to direct the film. That amateur being Steven Spielberg. See, Jaws was never meant to be a horror film. It's still not widely considered one. There was nothing supernatural, no element of mystery, as the killer shark was right in your face in all of the posters. Everyone knew what a shark looked like, so building any mystery around it didn't make any sense. The movie was simply about a shark killing lots of people on a beach, the classic slasher concept, but that was not yet a thing. So how did Jaws become a horror classic? Well, it was an accident, an error. You see, Spielberg decided to build an animatronic shark replica for the film, the things we see nowadays in Disneyland. It was apparently the easiest way to portray a 25 feet shark at that time. But problems began when the replica kept on malfunctioning for the majority of the shoot, uncertain about its future. Spielberg had to shoot most of the film without the shark, which forced him to turn 2/3 of the film into a mystery horror kind of story. They had to resort to building suspense and throwing in a few jump scares. What made it special is the fact that Jaws did suspense and shock better than most horror movies of its time. One of its scenes is still considered by many as the best jump scare in cinema history. The final product that we got was a mix of 3 genres: slasher, detective mystery, and adventure.
Smile, you son of a...
Jaws was the first proper non-cringe monster movie, and people loved it all around the world. Steven Spielberg became a household name. The suspense building, along with John Williams' iconic score, was held as a gold standard for films to come. Jaws went on to inspire many iconic films over the years, like The Orca, Deep Blue Sea, and the Piranha movies. It inspired Spielberg himself to direct the Jurassic Park movies. The rest of the 70s and 80s was the golden period of horror cinema. Movies like Carrie, Alien, Hellraiser, The Thing, The Shining, and many more graced the screens of theaters. When the audience started to move more towards television in the early 70s, horror movies brought the crowd back into the theaters. But unfortunately today, horror films aren't credited enough for saving Hollywood. Like if you ask someone, which movie saved Hollywood in the 70s? You're mostly going to get hit by one answer: The Godfather. Watch this video for the fucked up story behind The Godfather. and Marlon Brando himself.